Most people have no idea that the heartlands of early Christianity, Egypt, Syria, North Africa, and even parts of Turkey, were conquered by Islam in just over a century. So let's start right after Muhammad dies. His first successor is Abu Bakr. He's actually Muhammad's father-in-law because Muhammad married his young daughter Aisha. So Abu Bakr only rules for about 2 years. He's already elderly when he takes over and he dies pretty quickly. But those 2 years were famous for something called Ridda Wars, the apostasy wars. A lot of tribes in Arabia had sort of submitted to Muhammad, but once he died, many of them tried to break away. Abu Bakr is the one who comes down hard on them. He fights these tribes and basically forces Arabia back into line. So if Muhammad starts the movement, Abu Bakr is the one who really consolidates Arabia. Under him, Islam stops being just a loose collection of tribes and becomes a solid political religious power in the peninsula. Now, here's where things really start to shift. After Abu Bakr comes the second caliph, Omar. His reign is about a decade, and this is when the great Arab conquests really explode. Around 636 under Umar, you start seeing jihad, not just inside Arabia, but erupting outward against everyone around them. They attack what was called Greater Syria. And it's not just modern Syria, but the whole Eastern Mediterranean. So Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and parts of Iraq. They move against Persia. They keep pushing and pushing outward. And here's the part we tend to forget. Most of those regions, Greater Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, were not always Muslim. They were deeply Christian. So let me say that again, because this is really important and most people never hear it. When you hear Egypt, Syria, North Africa, Turkey, in that time period, you're talking about the heartlands of early Christianity, not some vague Muslim world. Now, let me tell you why that matters. If you looked at a map of the Christian world after Constantine, early 300s AD, Christendom stretched all across North Africa, from Egypt to Morocco, all across the Middle East, all of Asia Minor, that's modern Turkey, and then into Europe, west and south of the Danube and the Rhine. This was the Christian world. Now, between the year 632, Muhammad's death, and 732, the Battle of Tours in France, Islam conquers most of that. In about 100 years, they overrun all the Middle East, all North Africa, and all the way into Spain by 711. Now, depending on how you measure it, they took something like 2/3 or 3/4 of the original Christian world. And the really painful thing is, they took the most important centers. So back then, the church had 5 main centers, 5 big bishoprics. Rome in the west, that one stayed free for a long time. Alexandria, Egypt, Antioch in Syria, and Jerusalem and Constantinople, in which we now call Istanbul. So four of those five either fell quickly or eventually came under Islamic rule. Now, here's the part that really shocked me when I first started studying this. There is a pivotal battle called the Battle of Yarmak. It's in Syria near the Yarmak River, and that is central. Many historians call it one of the most consequential battles in world history. Now, why is that? Because if the Arabs had lost at Yarmak, things would have gone very differently. Instead, they defeated Eastern Roman in Byzantine, the army, and after that, it's like a domino effect. Jerusalem falls a year later. Egypt is conquered around 640, 641. North Africa follows. Libya, Tunisia, all the way across. By 711, Muslim armies cross into Spain. So imagine this with a modern analogy. It would be like if, in the space of about a century, Hindus had conquered most of Europe and half of North America. You'd feel that, right? Well, you'd know something massive had been happening in the Christian world. Now, that's basically what happened from the Christian perspective in the 600s and 700s. Now, here's where it really applies to you, my friend. A lot of people today have this picture in their mind that places like Egypt, Syria, Morocco, Turkey were always Muslim. But as I said, they weren't. These were some of the oldest and strongest Christian regions on earth. Think of St. Augustine, one of the great fathers of Western theology. So where was he from? North Africa, Hippo, in what is now Tanzania. Those lands, those churches, those Christian communities were conquered and gradually Islamized. So when we later get to the Crusades, we're not talking about Christians suddenly decide, oh, let's go randomly invade peaceful Muslim lands. No. For centuries, the Christians had been losing territory, churches, and lives to ongoing Islamic expansion. But that's not even the full picture yet. Fast forward a few centuries right before the First Crusade. During the early caliphates, especially in the Abbasid period, many Muslim rulers actually allowed Christian pilgrims to come into the Holy Land, which is Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In those sites, it wasn't easy, but there were heavy taxes, plenty of mistreatment, but generally pilgrims could still go. That began to change when a new power showed up, the Turks. From around the 900s to the 1000s, the Turks start coming in from Central Asia as slave soldiers. The caliphs bring them in, convert them to Islam, train them as warriors, and before long, these Turkish warriors are a real power behind the scenes. You get the Seljuk Empire rising up. The Abbasid Caliph is basically a puppet at this point, and the Turks are calling the shots. Sultan literally means power holder. Now, this next bit might challenge the way you've heard the story. Some modern historians like to say, oh, the Seljuks were just tough nomads who happened to be Muslim. It wasn't really about religion. But when you read the Christian sources from that time, eyewitnesses and near contemporaries, you'll see a very strong religious hostility. Writers like Matthew of Edessa describe what the Turks did to the Armenian Christians and other believers. Tens of thousands massacred, thousands of churches burned. The Armenian capital, Ani, called the city of 1,000 churches, devastated. Crosses broken, statues decapitated, icons gouged out, altars desecrated. This happened around the 1000s, long before the 1900s genocides we usually hear about. It's a much older pattern. Then comes 1071, the Battle of Manzikert in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, near the Armenian areas. The Byzantine emperor marches out with one of his largest armies to stop the Turks. They're crushed. The emperor is captured, something that hasn't happened in about 1,000 years. After that, the Turks pour into Asia Minor, and they take almost all of what we now call Turkey, and they're pressing right up towards Constantinople. At this time, they're also hitting the Holy Land hard. Earlier, under more stable Muslim rule, Christian pilgrimages had been tolerated, even if abused, but the Turks began attacking pilgrims, exhorting them for even more money, sometimes not allowing them to leave. They desecrated holy Christian sites. One specifically horrific story from around 1064 talks about a large German pilgrimage. The sources describe among them a very beautiful abbess, a nun who was warned not to go because everyone knew how dangerous it was. She refused to turn back. The account says the Turks killed the pilgrims, gang raped her until she died. And then notes, the Turks did this very frequently to pilgrims. It wasn't a one-off, it was a pattern. And again, it wasn't only the Turks. Earlier in 1009, Fatimid Caliph al-Hakam in Egypt ordered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the place marking Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, to be destroyed and leveled to the ground. One Muslim historian, al-Makrizi, writes that this same caliph destroyed around 30,000 churches and synagogues in Egypt and Greater Syria. Remember, those regions were still heavily Christian. At that point, around 1009, the Pope of the time wanted to call some kind of early crusade, but nothing really materialized. Still, you can feel it building, century after century. The loss of Christian lands, slaughter and enslavement of Christians, desecration of the holy sites, pilgrims abused and killed. And now the Turks are standing almost at the doorstep of Constantinople. So what happens? The Emperor of Constantinople finally sends out a plea for help to the Christians in the West. That's the real backdrop, the First Crusade in 1095. So what was the stated goal? On paper and in the sermons and letters of the time, there were two main things: to secure the safe access to the Holy Land for the Christian pilgrims, and to liberate those holy places that had been Christian before they were taken. Now, to help fellow Christians in the East, the Byzantines and other Eastern churches who were attacked and losing everything, the goal was to help the fellow Christians in the East, the Byzantines and other Eastern churches who were being attacked and losing everything. One of the key biblical ideas used was Jesus' command: love God with all your heart, going to rescue and rededicate the Holy Land, the places associated with Christ. Love your neighbor as yourself, helping Eastern Christians and vulnerable pilgrims. Now, were there people with mixed motives? Absolutely. We're talking about fallen human beings, but if you read the actual sources from that period, they are constantly referring to what was happening to Christians, how the Holy Land was being defiled, how the churches were being destroyed, how believers were being slaughtered and enslaved. That's what they say they were responding to. A lot of modern theories, it was just a landless second sons. It was about colonization, pure greed. Those came much later and don't really fit the evidence the people at the time left behind. Now, I want to zoom out for a second and show you the bigger arc here, because this pattern doesn't stop in the Middle Ages. Islam remains dominant for centuries, and especially under the Ottoman Empire. From the 1300s to the 1900s, the Muslim world is the powerhouse, not Europe. We often act like Europe was always the big bully and everyone else was trembling. Historically, for a very long time, it was often the other way around. By 1683, the Ottomans were at Vienna with something like 200 to 300,000 fighters surrounding the city. Remember where we started? First Christian territories attacked in 630. Now, 1,000 years later, Islamic armies are at the gates of Central Europe, still using the same language, jihad, three choices: convert, submit and pay, or fight. The same basic logic, and it doesn't even end there. So let me bring this closer to home. After the United States breaks from Britain and becomes its own nation, its first war as an independent country is with Muslim powers, the Barbary Wars. Here's what's going on. For a long time, Muslim corsairs or pirates from North Africa, places like Algiers, Tripoli, Tunis, made a living raiding European ships and coastal towns, capturing Christians as slaves. They were going as far as Iceland to take people. Now, many European nations, instead of constantly fighting, started paying them off. They'd pay a kind of tribute, and the Muslim rulers saw as jizya, the tax paid by the subdued non-Muslims. In their minds, these Christian nations were acknowledging Islamic superiority. When America breaks free from Britain, it's no longer covered by Britain's payments. As soon as the Barbary states realized this, they start attacking American ships, enslaving American sailors, abusing them in horrible ways, things which you could learn about in this book called The Sword and the Scimitar. Now, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams actually try the diplomatic route. They meet with a Barbary ambassador basically saying, why can't we just trade peacefully? Why can't we live in peace together? Very, very American question, right? The ambassador's response sounds exactly like something you'd hear from ISIS today. Paraphrasing, basically he says, our prophet and our holy book command us to fight you, to plunder you, to enslave you until you acknowledge Allah alone. Same logic, same theology, same jihad, just in a different century on a different continent. Now, here's the part that really surprised me when I first connected the dots. At the same time as these early American conflicts with Barbary Muslims, something else happens. Napoleon invades Egypt in 1798 and he conquers it pretty easily. Historians often mark that as the start of the colonial era in the Muslim world. From that point on, power balance shifts. For centuries, Islamic empires, especially the Ottomans, have been the ones pushing outwards. Now Europe has more advanced technology, stronger militaries, stronger economies. And Europe begins pushing into formerly Muslim lands. What a lot of people don't realize is many European leaders saw themselves in their own minds as continuing the old struggle. They used explicit Crusader language. There's a story, I believe it was General Allenby, that when he entered Jerusalem in World War I, he visited Saladin's tomb. He supposedly kicked it and said, "We're back," meaning the Crusaders, the Franks, the Christian West. So in their minds, this wasn't just colonization, it was picking up an old unfinished war. But why did that power shift happen? But the short version is this. Much of the traditional Islamic system was built on conquest, plunder, and slavery. When expansion slowed or stopped, when there was no more lands to easily conquer and pillage, the economic system started to collapse. Some Muslim regions adapted by modernizing. The Ottomans, for example, gradually adopted Western military tactics, technology, even clothing and script under the Ataturk Turkey. They abandoned the Arabic alphabet and took on the Latin script. They adopted Western style dress, shaved their beards, secularized public life. In other words, the very empire that had once been the chief standard bearer of jihad began looking to the West for survival and identity. Meanwhile, the more traditional jihad-based systems, without new lands to conquer, without plunder and slavery to fuel their economies, became weaker and weaker. They struggled to function in a world shaped by modern technology and industrial power. So, why am I telling you all this, friend? Because I want you to see a few things really clearly. You see, history is not random. There is a spiritual battle behind all this. The early Christian world lost huge portions of its heartland to conquest. And that pain, that loss, that cry for help is what gives rise to things like the Crusades. The same spirit of conquest, domination, in the name of religion, keeps showing up in different forms across the centuries. And yet through it all, God has preserved his people. The church is still here. The gospel is still going out. We don't have to hate Muslims, to be honest, about history. But we're called to love them, to pray for them, to share Christ with them. But love also tells the truth. It doesn't rewrite the story to make everyone feel better. The thing is, when you really understand the story, you stop falling for these shallow narratives. Like, Islam was always peaceful until the bad Christians attacked. Or on the other side, Christians were just greedy colonizers with no spiritual motive. Both of those are distortions. Real history is more complicated, and underneath it, there's a very real enemy. Not flesh and blood, but spiritual powers, pushing kingdoms, empires, and men's hearts away from the living God. So yeah, I'm probably rambling a bit, but I just wanted you to see what we're living through right now has deep roots. This isn't new, and it's not out of God's control. God is still on the throne. Jesus is still Lord of history. And even when it looks like darkness is winning for a time, he is quietly preserving, purifying, and positioning his people. So hold on to that. Bless you, friend. God bless you. And if you got something out of this, please share it with someone who you might find interesting. And if you subscribe for more content like this, it really obviously supports the channel. All right. Let me know your thoughts. Did you get anything out of it? All right. Thanks, guys. This is Kev. Bless you. Bye-bye.